All right, we are now recording. So thank you everyone for joining our April Garden Talk. Dar Hawkins will be talking about lasagna gardening. This is a unique way of starting beds, and I'm going to hand it over to Dar. Dar, you will have to unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. All right, my name is Darlyn Hawkins. Most people call me Dar. I've been a master gardener here in Genesee County since 2004, which sounds like quite a long time. It is, but I'm still learning every day. And I hope you will learn every day too, because there's a lot to learn. And it's a beautiful day. We're just getting through with winter. We've got some spring weather, and I think everybody's antsy to get outside. We were supposed to have snow last night, but we didn't. So I hesitate to get everybody started too early, but this will give you an idea of how you can start planning your gardens for this summer and this fall. And this method is called lasagna gardening because it resembles making a lasagna. Now, if you haven't made lasagna and you're not a cook, I think most people have eaten lasagna or know what it is. And it's basically layering your noodles, your sauce. We're having a problem with the audio. You're cutting in and out. Oh. So maybe get closer to your computer. Closer to the mic? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is that any better? Okay. So lasagna, we have layering of your noodles, your sauce, your cheese, etc. Well, in this layering, it's going to be with other items. And hopefully, it'll give you an idea of what you can do to make an easier garden. So I'm going to go on to the next page here. The definition is layering organic material, which is another name for that is called sheet composting, directly on a planting area to improve soil and reduce the need for tilling, digging, or weeding. Now, when we say organic material, it doesn't mean that you have to buy all your stuff at the organic section of your produce store. It's not the same thing. Organic in this sense is things that have grown and are dying or have died and going to a carbon-based unit. So a little bit different than organic. Organic in the supermarket is something grown without chemicals. Okay, so why is this a lazy gardener's dream? There's no double digging, no rototilling, less watering, and less weeding. Now, double digging, that's when we dig the sod out, get down to the earth underneath all those roots, dig everything, get the soil off that grass and put it back in, add your some soil on top. That's a lot of digging, a lot of work. No rototilling. Rototilling, I think most of you have seen a rototiller. They're usually pretty good size and dig up the earth, and then you have to go back and rake out all the weeds, that type of work. Less watering because the soil is not as compacted, and it usually is much easier the water absorbs. Less weeding. I said less weeding, not no weeding. Okay, so, but it does help because of the composting. Okay, who might be interested in lasagna gardening? Well, power tool challenged. I don't know about you, but if you've ever tried using a rototiller, you've probably seen the ads that show using a tiller with one finger and you're walking along beside it, and it makes it look so easy. It's definitely not easy. It's not even easy to start a tiller, let alone use it, especially in clay soil. So, power tool challenged. Those with age or physical limitations. As we get older, you'll find it harder and harder to get up and down and do all that digging. You might have arthritis and it's hard to use those hand tools. those interested in recycling. I don't know about you, but hopefully most people are interested in recycling these days. Use those vegetable peels. Use the materials around your house that you might be throwing away that would go in a garden. And we'll go over that, what we're talking about. And anyone who wants less work with more results. I think that's probably all of us. Okay, lasagna gardening is an organic layering method used to create new garden beds and improve soil. What can be used? We can use wood ashes if you have those fire pits out back, or if you have a fireplace, you'll have wood ashes. Peat moss you can buy at mostly the big box stores, and we'll kind of go over peat moss a little bit. Chopped leaves. You can use leaves that are not chopped, but chopped leaves will decompose faster. Grass clippings. If you bag your grass as you're mowing it instead of using a mulcher, or you've waited too long, it's been really wet, and you have to go and rake your lawn, you'll have those grass clippings. Compost. Hopefully you have your own compost bin. If you do not, you can buy compost. Barn litter. Barn litter is like your manures that are mixed with usually straw that's been put down on a bed for the animals. So barn litter is good. And newspaper. There's less and less newspaper these days because people are reading online, but there are still a lot of waste paper type things. You get the junk mail that you can put through the shredder. Newspaper is very good though because of the type of ink and the absorbency and so on. Okay, so before we get started with making our lasagna, we have to gather our material. And I would recommend gathering your stuff way ahead of time because it takes a lot of material to actually make a small garden. You'd be surprised. So I would recommend starting out small. So get your chopped leaves. Now works best in the fall when you've raked your yard, you've got all those leaves coming down. Maybe you have a mulcher, or you can run over the leaves with a lawnmower. And even if they're not chopped, if you're making it in the fall, that's okay. It works better, just as well when they're not chopped. But chopped just disintegrates faster. Straw. You might have a neighbor that has straw. You may have to buy it, but straw is very good. You don't necessarily need it, but straw is good. Hay is good also. The thing to be careful about hay is hay has more seeds in it. So if you're going to use hay, put it toward the bottom of your garden. Sawdust. Sawdust is good when you're layering, but use a limited amount because it just takes more energy for it to decompose, and it robs minerals. Peat moss is good. The thing I would warn about peat moss is that peat moss is in a limited commodity. If you're looking ecologically, there's a limited amount of peat moss, and when it is dug up, it does release carbon dioxide, and you have to think about the environment. But it works great in a lasagna bed. So who are you going to gather your materials from? Neighbors. I had a neighbor that couldn't wait to get rid of his grass one year. And I have another neighbor that has a lot of straw. She puts it around the outside of her house every year, and she gets new straw every fall. So I get to take her old straw that is partially rotted in the spring. What about the town landfill? If you have a town landfill, many times they have piles and piles of rotted leaves, mulched wood. You do have to be careful about the mulched wood, especially because it can have different things in it that are not good for your garden. whether it be all just different things that you wouldn't want. Okay, so be careful with that. It has to be well rotted too. And your local businesses. I went to my gym one year and I saw they were shredding all their old paperwork. They had bags and bags of shredded material. And they were more than happy for me to take their shredded paper away. Okay, so be sure to include high nitrogen materials. The high nitrogen materials are the things that are green, are mostly green. They've been recently living. Your manures, grass clippings. You see they're green and they're going to take them a while to decompose. Compost. If you have your own compost pile, or again, if you buy compost, weeds. Weeds are okay. Try to get them though without those flower heads on that have the weed seeds. And if you do use weeds, they can go again near the bottom of the pile. Okay, so we can compost all year. Create a compost pile and use it to create your lasagna garden. You dress perennial plants, top older lasagna gardens. And it's easy if you have the room. If you're living in an apartment, it's a little bit harder to make your own compost. But kitchen scraps add up fast. Keep scraps out of the landfill, amend the soil. Use them instead of paying to have your scraps taken away in your garbage. Keep your kitchen scraps and make a compost pile. We'll briefly touch on that, but I think there's going to be another program in the future talking specifically about making compost. So we do not want fats or meats, bones, oils, or tree needles in our compost. No fats, they can get rancid, smelly, and attract animals. The same with your meats and bones attract animals. Oils, they just don't decompose. And some tree needles can be very acid, so you have to be very careful with that. Select your area. Now, this is my garden, and I started out this way because I didn't know anything about lasagna gardening, to be quite honest. So here's some rhubarb, and back here's asparagus, and I've got something else planted over here. If you look right here where my arrow is, that is my compost bin. That's not the greatest, but it's a plastic trash barrel with holes drilled in, so water can leach out, air can get in. The thing about this type of a compactor is it's harder to move your scraps, things around, and they do have to be moved to get the aeration and forget that rotting. So anyway, that's my compost bin. And just about every day or every other day, I take all my vegetable scraps and bring it out there. That's no longer there. I have a better one. But anyway, this is where I plan to make my lasagna garden, right here. Okay, so select your area. And a lot should go into selecting your area. Like I said, this was just a practice run, kind of. Okay, so plan, plan, plan. And this is true for any garden, not just your lasagna garden. Select a site. Okay, I really want to plant. Where am I going to plant? Sun or shade? Okay, I really want to plant some flowers that do very well in the sun, but all I have is a shady area. It gets morning sun, but in the afternoon, does it get sun? You have to think about that. And the time of the year. Now I have a spot that when I planted it, got sun just about all day long. But we also planted maple trees. And now it gets sun in the morning, in the afternoon, especially in the summer, it gets very, very little sun. It's all shade. So you have to think about those things. Is it sunny in the spring, shaded in the summer? Wind and water. You want a good water supply close by if at all possible, but you don't want it to be in the middle of someplace that when it does rain, it gets flooded. and soggy? Or is it going to be so dry and you're not going to be able to get water to it? Okay, and good air circulation. Does it have, is it a spot where there's no air flowing at all? It's maybe surrounded on 3 sides with buildings and the air just doesn't flow? Or does it have gale force winds like some of my house does, where from the west, when it blows, it's like a gale? You think, okay, so you selected your spot. This is mine. So you start out with a good bottom layer that normally there'd be grass or weeds underneath. You want a thick layer of cardboard. If at all possible, if you do not have cardboard that's going to smother your weeds, you can have thick pieces of overlapping paper, newspaper. So thick layers of newspaper that are positioned so they overlap each other, and use water. You can see my hose there. Where is it? Oops. I guess I went to the next page. No. I'm too ahead. There we go. There's the hose. Okay. So keep that moist, and it keeps the, not only gives it a good base, but keeps, if there's any wind at all, it'll keep the papers from flying all over your neighborhood. Okay, so then we're going to layer over the cardboard, over the papers. You're going to put a layer of material. So you're going to be layering, alternating pretty much with your high carbon and your nitrogen materials. So this, I put, I think that's compost on there, but you could put your grass clippings there too, something, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, so I've got grass clippings on top of that, so there'd be a high nitrogen. What's below is your high carbon. When you're putting your nitrogen materials on, especially, do not make them too thick, because if they're thick, they will not decompose well. And it takes more energy to decompose your nitrogen materials. Now, if you notice, I'm going to give you a little hint here, because this is a mistake I made. I started putting almost everything in the middle, and you'll notice the sides, it goes up like a mountain. And when I layered newspaper in between, I did not shred my newspaper. They were just layers of newspaper. I ended up, when I watered it, all the water would run off the sides because it couldn't absorb. And that's just the mountain look. So learn from me. So after the first layer is done, you can add your organic material in layers. Try to include your high carbon, such as leaves, straw, hay, and high nitrogen ingredients like grass clippings, kitchen waste, manure. Generally, we use 4 parts of high carbon materials to 1 part high nitrogen material. If you're low on nitrogen materials, add blood meal to your mix. Now, you can buy blood meal at most garden stores, garden factories, the big box stores. But that's pretty important to have more high carbon than nitrogen. Okay, so we continue layering till you have a depth of 18 inches to 2 feet. Again, there's another layer. And again, I'm watering in between. And you can plant directly in that bed, or you can cook it. Like you'd cook any good lasagna. It is better if it sits for a while and everything starts to decompose, meld together, and works better if you start it, say, in the summer, let it cook over the winter, and use it the next spring. However, my garden bed, and you will see you can start right at the beginning and don't let it cook or decompose, and you can use it anyway. When it does decompose, or when it cooks, though, it will go from those 18, 24 inches down to maybe 6 inches or 12 inches. You'll see that it will, I won't say shrink, but the things will, as they decompose, will get less and less as far as how big it looks. So if you do decide to cook your garden bed, make it your 18 inches, 24 inches, and put black plastic down over top, or get a big tarp. Put your edges down with bricks, weigh it down so the plastic doesn't blow away. Or you could use those garden staples. And the sun's warmth will heat it up and cook it. That means it'll decompose faster. So leave the plastic on for 6 weeks if you can, or even better, make it in the fall and leave the plastic on all winter and plant it in the spring. I know we're all just starting spring, so we're all anxious to get going. Okay, if your weeds do pop up, say cover it with mulch. I would say pull the weeds first and then put more mulch on, because there's anybody that knows gardening, has gardened, when you mulch, you have a lot fewer weeds. You can see all my weeds here in between. But also with lasagna gardening, you can plant things a little bit closer. So that helps too. Now the flower beds shown on the next scenes were used making lasagna garden. Now this was 5 years previous to this presentation was made. You see her lasagna garden was along a fence. And this is a very good idea, not to make it out in the middle of a garden like I did, but to make it in a spot where you don't have to dig all that up ahead of time. You lay your cardboard, layer newspaper, layer your straw or hay, your grass clippings, all that compost. And then your top layer really should be something that you can plant in right away if you're going to use it as a layer of bought-in compost or good soil. And there's on the other side of her house. This is not my house, it's a friend's house. And you'll see that although that was probably 18 inches when she started in height, how it's decomposed and just looks the same level as her lawn. And when you have a lawn like this, you're going to have lawn growing into the bed. So just because we say less weeding doesn't mean you're not going to have to weed, because you're still going to have to keep it cleaned out. But the beginnings of your garden are much easier. There's a better view. Okay, now container lasagna gardening. You don't have to limit lasagna gardening to an outside garden. You can make a raised bed, which they're very popular this year, and I think it's a very good way to use lasagna gardening, especially because you have probably 18, 24 inches at least to fill, and to fill all that with soil that you buy at your big box store, or to have somebody deliver, that's a lot of soil. So if you can use the lasagna method to get it started, and especially put that base down so you don't have to worry about weeds coming up through, that's the way to go. So, and as you'll see this wheelbarrow here, I think that's beautiful. I would want some holes in the bottom for drainage, or any kind of container that you have, but you can use it lasagna gardening in just about any container. You just use the same method of layering. I recommend you start small, because it's amazing how many kitchen scraps it takes to make a layer in your garden. And I, every time I peel a potato or crack an egg, I save those, all the coffee grounds, save all those things, and you think, wow, I have a good sized container every day. Well, it still takes an awful lot to fill space, say 3 by even 6 or 3 by 9. So keep all those. If you can make a compost bin and save them all ahead of time, that certainly helps. Wet your newspapers for easier handling. Shred the newspapers and other paper for your inner layers. The bottom, it's fine to have whole pieces of paper, but as you get in the inner layers, you want faster drainage and better decomposition. And remember, small particles decompose faster. Chop materials before adding. So if you have a blender and blend up all your scraps, that's great, but most people probably are not going to do that. Some materials are slow to decompose, so don't use materials such as grass clippings, wood chips, and thick layers. Use them sparingly. Do not use materials from diseased plants. Do not use cat or dog waste. Do not use the glossy section of newspaper. The glossy section, I don't think absorbs the paper, absorbs water as well. And I think most of it is made with um, inks now that are edible and usable, but still, it's probably better not to use the glossy sections. Dog or cat waste can have harmful things for people in. So you don't want that. Before we get into the resources, which I will show you this book, excellent book. Let me go back one page. But as far as when you're layering, and we went over which to layer, your 4-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. Carbon things are, like I said, things that are still basically have lived recently. Your chopped leaves, straw, hay, sawdust, peat moss, the brown leaves and brown material. Nitrogen is more like your moist grass clippings, kitchen waste, manure, blood meal. If you don't have enough of these things, ask your neighbors. You might have to go to the store and get a few of these things, but it's still cheaper than filling your whole bed with material that you have to buy. And it's much easier than doing the hand digging. Okay, so these are my resources. This is Lasagna Gardening by Patricia Lands. This is the book. It is available on Amazon. I just looked last night, as a matter of fact, to find the price. It is $15.50 on Amazon. There's a Lasagna Gardening for Small Spaces that is $12.49 on Amazon. And there's another one, Lasagna Gardening with Herbs, that's $18.99 on Amazon. So these are all good books about lasagna gardening, and not only that, they give hints on how much potassium maybe a pepper plant will use, and which better to grow together, tomatoes and basil, or what needs more light. But so there's a lot more information in that book than just the layering method that we talked about. Are there any questions?
All right, great, Dar. Yes, we had one come up in the chat. What about weed seeds in the grass?
Yeah, they may come up through. I try to put anything with seeds, weed seeds at all, whether it's the weeds that I've pulled from my garden or the weed seeds in the grass, for the bottom of the bed. So you'd be layering the cardboard, other things, your weed type stuff at the bottom, and maybe more composted stuff near the top. You will probably get weeds almost no matter what you do, but you should have less weeds than you normally would if you just tilled that garden spot and planted directly in the ground. So you may have some. I can't guarantee you wouldn't.
Yeah, and just one point, dandelions, I would not add them in even at the bottom because those roots will root. Yeah. We had another question come in. Is it safe to use newspaper for an organic garden?
It's a good question. Newspaper wouldn't have any chemicals. No, I don't know. It is a very good question.
Yeah, we might have to do a little research on that. I think most of the newspapers now don't use inks or things with the metals like they used to. But tell you what, Lois, we'll do a little checking on that, and when we send the link out to everybody. I'll include it in the email as to what we found. Jennifer's asking, does this need to be modified for an existing garden? So can you kind of incorporate?
You can incorporate. In fact, every year after you make your first lasagna garden, you'll find yourself adding more to it because they do tend to deteriorate. I don't see why you couldn't just keep adding to an existing garden and put your compost on top of that. Yes, as a matter of fact, I can tell you for a fact, I've used shredded paper in my garden and my regular garden. Around my plants is a mulch, and then it incorporates in. Basically, the thing and making the compost pile is basically kind of like adding to your garden. That answer your question?
I think that makes sense. Christine did comment that newspapers use organic ink today, so you can use in an organic garden.
Wonderful. See, we all learn every day.
Let's see. Someone asked about using this in a perennial garden, and I think that's pretty similar to what you just answered.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know personally I've used, let's say, an abbreviated lasagna garden when I've started some beds, basically using the cardboard to kill the grass if you want to start a new bed. I think that's, you know, I used the cardboard and I used mulch because I was just trying to kill the grass. But for vegetable gardening, or if you need to raise your level up a little bit and use some of these materials, it's a great way to add organic matter to your site. And for those of you who have a heavy clay soil, this might be a good way for you to raise the level of your beds and add that organic matter to the clay soil more quickly.
Good point. The other thing I forgot to mention is checking your pH. Because depending on what you put in will change the pH of your garden. And that's true every year, all your gardens. So periodically check the pH, and that will give you a better idea how to amend your soil for what you're going to grow. Because it'll make a difference if you plan on putting azaleas in there, or if you're going to put just petunias or annuals. It'll make a difference.
Oh, one last question, Dar. Using grass clippings, what if you use a lawn treatment or herbicides or insecticides?
I forgot to mention that. I don't think I would use lawn clippings from a yard that has had all kinds of herbicides and stuff on it. They say it's safe after a certain amount of time, like to walk on your yard and all that with all those chemicals on. But I would be hesitant to use those same chemicals in a bed that I was going to eat the food out of, planting my vegetables. Maybe to put in a bed for flowers, it might probably fine. But I would be very careful.
And I think too, it would depend on the herbicide you're using, because some have a long residual time. You may actually end up killing some of the plants you're putting in the garden. And one other thought, I know when you were talking about wood chips from like a municipal source, you don't know if there's black walnut in there, and black walnut can affect especially tomato plants. And also you can end up with poison ivy. So yeah, be a little wary of things from the landfill or transfer stations. Oh, we've got a few more questions. Will bulbs, rhizomes need to be dug up as the garden is built up? So I think she's talking about a perennial flower bed.
Yeah, okay, afterwards. You shouldn't have to, because the garden bed will accommodate, I guess, because just from my own experience, I have bulbs planted and every year I put mulch on top of that bed, and they keep flowering as well as ever. I don't, there's no reason to dig them up that I know of.
Yeah, and the material shrinks down, so I think your bulbs will find that happy medium. Yeah. We did have another comment from Christine. She agrees about the treated grass. She's apparently seen some webinars on composting that say wait 3 to 4 months after application. So I think I would still be hesitant on some of the herbicides because some do have a long residual life, but that's something good to check. What does shredded newspaper do for the soil?
I think mainly it helps keeps the soil loose. It works and it absorbs water too, and it breaks down easy. I really don't know any other reason to use it.
It's a good form of, yeah, it's a good form of carbon. For those who do worm composting, shredded newspaper is usually what the bedding for the worms are, so they will break those down. It's a good way to also get rid of your newspaper.
Why pay to have it taken away?
Any other questions for Dar? We had some good conversation here. Well, while you're thinking, I'm just going to give you a little update on our next garden talk, which will be May 6th. Brandy Waite will be doing a talk on raised bed basics. So similar to this one, but the more formal raised beds that people are building and filling. She's going to give us some raised bed basics. June 3rd, we will be talking about playing in the dirt, the risks and benefits of gardening. And then 2 non-garden talks. April 22nd, I will be creating a backyard habitat. That's Earth Day, so be here at noon on Earth Day. And then on May 20th at noon, we'll also be talking about house strip gardening with Connie Boyd. So those are the programs we have coming up next. And if no one else has any questions, I'd like to thank Dar today for doing her lasagna gardening talk. And thanks to everyone for participating. It's nice to see folks even virtually. So hopefully we'll see you in one of our next talks. And I will be sending out the YouTube link once we get it up on our YouTube page. So if you missed some of our past talks, we are recording them and we are posting them to our YouTube page. So thanks, everyone.
Bye.